Question: why are some countries rich while others are poor? After centuries of debate, there might finally be an answer to that question. According to Harvard professor James Robinson and MIT economist Daron Acemoglu, it's all about political institutions, and how said political institutions keep a small minority elite from obtaining all of the wealth. They say things such as resources and health conditions and population are all secondary issues. Take a country with the same resources, health conditions, and population, then interject an arbitrary political border. These two new countries will have startling economic differences. Example: North and South Korea have the same homogeneous population and natural resources, yet South Korea yields over 10 times the amount of money that North Korea does. According to our theory, this is due to North Korea's crippling farming regulations, military spending, and lack of monetary incentive for the general population. Or take feudal Europe. The peasant farmer has no incentive to produce anything because he knows the wealthy elite is just going to come and take whatever he makes anyways.
No! Aha! I'm Ryan Avent, economics correspondent for The Economist. Joining me in our New York studio is Daron Acemoglu, an economist at MIT and author with James Robinson of the new book, Why Nations Fail. The book argues that to understand the failure of many nations to develop and become rich, we must look at political institutions and the incentives they create for leaders. Mr. Acemoglu, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Ryan.
In your book, you demonstrate through a wealth of historical examples that institutions can be self-perpetuating, that bad institutions strengthen bad leaders and sort of help to keep those bad leaders in place. Can you tell us a little bit about historically how nations have broken out of this cycle?
I think that's one of the most difficult challenges facing any nation. Once you have what we call extractive institutions that strengthen the rule of the elites and enable them to get their way at the expense of the society, how do you break out of them? And there are essentially two ways. One is a gradual movement out of extractive institutions. That's the path that Britain, for example, followed in the 19th century through a series of gradual reforms of the political system, of the educational system, of the civil service. But unfortunately, that path is not open to many societies, as we have seen, for example, in the context of the Arab Spring. And when that's the case, when the old guard holds on to power because they don't want to be the losers out of the transition, then a more revolutionary change is necessary.
Should we be encouraged by the recent declines in global poverty? And a lot of that is associated with growth in China and India. And in your book, you announced some skepticism about the model of development in China. Should we nonetheless be encouraged by declines in poverty?
Of course, it's a huge achievement for humanity. I think the right perspective to look at that is that China really started a fundamental transformation of their economic institutions. And those changes are responsible for the increase in productivity in agriculture and later in industry, and are responsible for the lifting of almost 1 billion people out of poverty or near poverty into much higher living standards. But the Chinese model is not one to be emulated by every country because it's based on extractive growth, meaning it's still under the auspices of political institutions that are extractive and are controlled by a small elite. And in that respect, I don't think it's a system that's going to last. In particular, China is benefiting a lot from the low-hanging fruits of catch-up growth, importing technology and getting integrated into world market. But that's going to stop at some point, and at that point, incentives and innovations are going to start mattering a lot. And a fundamental transformation now in political institutions is going to be necessary for the continuation of that growth.
Is there reason to suspect that economic growth might contribute to political liberalization, that the rise of, say, a Chinese middle class might then sort of demand a change in institutions that would generate those incentives for innovative economic growth?
I think there is some truth to that, but it is sometimes exaggerated. There are many in social science and in policy circles who think that political institutions just follow economic prosperity. Sometimes that goes under the name of modernization theory. Just get the economy growing, and the political institutions, civil liberties, political rights are all going to follow. And I think that's not generally true. And I think the best way of thinking about that is to think about Russia or Saudi Arabia. Russia and Saudi Arabia have been doing very well in terms of their GDP growth lately because natural resource prices are high. But that sort of growth is not going to bring democratization. And I think in China, of course, the situation is different. There is a true middle class, but the Communist Party and the elites are able to keep that middle class in check. So there is no guarantee that just the enrichment of the middle class and economic growth is going to bring the next stage of political transformation in China.
In the book, you tell this fantastic story about the history of Venice and how Venice became a sort of a rich city-state based on these wonderful institutions that provided for upward mobility in trade. And eventually, the powers that be within Venice were able to sort of restrict this upward mobility, and that in turn led to sort of sclerosis in the economy and its eventual political decline. I think a lot of people might read that story and think of declining mobility in societies like the U.S. and wonder that, if after 200 years of sort of pluralistic democracy, are advanced societies at risk of complacency? Is there a risk that these institutions may deteriorate?
Entirely, and I think Venice is really the case in point. The remarkable thing about Venice, exactly like you say, is that it had reached a certain level of inclusiveness in its institutions, and when it started getting reversed, it came through the political institutions. First, there was a change in its political institutions, shutting off the new groups from entering into its parliament, its General Assembly, and then the economic institutions started changing, blocking young merchants and taking away the contracts that supported a flourishing overseas trade. And I think that's the real danger for the U.S. as well. We have been in the midst of a striking increase in economic inequality, and that's concerning for several reasons. But I think the more worrying problem is that together with economic inequality, we are experiencing a much greater level of political inequality. The US was famous for providing voice to a broad cross-section of society, and that's no longer true. Only the very wealthy who are able to make big campaign contributions, who have the lobbying machine and the clout, have voice. And that's where the real danger for a US institution lies. Once political inequality reaches a certain threshold, then economic mistakes start getting made.
Well, Professor Acemoglu, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks very much. It was my pleasure.